Welcome to Technology Simplified by IT Voice. Tech talk everyone can understand. I'm your host, Will Slappey, and today we have Frank DeBenedetto joining as our guest. He is a CEO over at Two Rivers Technology Group in New Jersey. He's a great friend of mine, and we're excited to have you on the podcast today, Frank.
Good afternoon, Will. Thanks for having me, buddy.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us and taking your time. I know you got a lot of things going on. We're going to talk today about PCI compliance, and I know that's something that you've got a lot of expertise in. So let's start out here for our listeners and just explain, what is PCI compliance?
Yeah, so PCI compliance is basically a set of, or a framework set of rules and regulations that was put in place in 2006 to help the credit card industry and all of the associated entities come up with a somewhat of a standard to follow to try to increase the security around the payments industry.
Yeah, that sounds pretty important, especially with all of the fraud and other things that are happening in terms of cybersecurity. So thanks for the explanation there. Some of the people listening to this might be thinking, well, I mean, I'm not a credit card processor. I'm not a bank. I'm just an average business. So if a company is not a financial services type of company, that would be pretty obvious this would be important to. Is it still important for those kind of companies to meet PCI compliance?
Yeah, so I own an MSP in New Jersey, and we've been in business for about 17 years. And a couple of things that I found was, number one, I didn't really have any visibility into the PCI compliance for the majority, if not all, of my customers that were accepting credit cards, right? And that was because traditionally MSPs don't really offer any kind of payments. So I knew that I'd get called into any kind of conversation if there was an issue, because it usually bleeds over to tech. So I'm giving you a little background here only because it kind of bleeds into that answer. So I knew that I'd have an implied risk with zero control if something should happen. And it didn't really matter what the industry was that I found. And upwards of about 60% of my customers do take credit cards. I'd say 20% of them started taking electronic payments during or just after the pandemic hit, because they wanted to get away from the paper checks and the ways they couldn't get to the bank. So yeah, it's vitally important for every industry, not just the financial services one, to make sure that they're adhering to the PCI compliance standards. Obviously, if you're in the financial services world, we're a little more hyper aware of the cybersecurity regulations, but you'll find, in most MSPs will find that the majority, upwards of 70% of their customers will take it. And it's important that we address all of them, because I'd argue, just one customer of yours that's not compliant means that you're not compliant as the MSP, right? You've got a security hole, and that's going to come back to you. So you better gain some visibility and better make sure that all those industries are secured.
Right. Yeah. So in a nutshell, it sounds like, hey, if you take any form of electronic payment, then now you need to be, you're subject to PCI compliance, and you need to be PCI compliant. So I guess if somebody out there is listening and they're like, oh, we don't take any electronic payments, then I guess they could move on to the next podcast. But like you said, 70+% probably take it in some capacity, so they need to be aware of it. So let's dive a little bit farther into that. So hey, you're listening, and hey, you fall into that 70% plus, and you're like, yeah, we hadn't even realized that, we hadn't thought about it. So why is it important then to be PCI compliant?
Yeah, so for the main reason is that, we want to contribute to good cyber hygiene, across all industries. And, and customers need to do their part in this process. MSPs need to fill a certain role here, and it works its way upstream. We'd like to think that our credit card processors and all the way on up to the Visa, MasterCards, American Expresses are all playing a role in there. But, because of the payments, this is one of those industries that's riddled with fraud, right? We saw it years and years ago. We might see and hear about a little bit less, because I think there's some other sexier cybersecurity crimes that we hear about, like ransomware. But it's a real thing, and it still does exist. So it's important to make sure that we're playing our role What's interesting is this is just a framework. So a lot of small businesses think that just because maybe they've checked the compliance box that they're also secure. They are independent things here, right? Just because you adhere to a certain framework, and that framework covers all sorts of things, such as like policies and procedures, right? Like things like don't write the credit card down, to technologies like let's make sure that that credit card data, if it is stored, is stored is encrypted, right? It can't be accessed, to things like using PCI compliant, credit card, chip readers. And we've seen the industries evolve. If you think about maybe 5 years ago, we didn't have the chips on the credit cards, right? Remember, we would just swipe them, and there was inherent risks with that. And because of the risk of fraud, the industry again got together from a technology standpoint. Now we're seeing credit cards with the chip readers on them. And so what that means is end customers would need to upgrade their point of sale readers to accept the chips. There was a deadline a while back that basically the end customers, if they don't have a chip reader and the card is swiped and there's fraud after such a date, they're 100% liable for that. So there's a variety of reasons why you want to keep up with this. I would say first and foremost because it'll hit businesses in the pocketbook, right? You can get chargebacks. Right. You can get increased processing fees to continue to be able to do business. Of course, there's reputational harm. So if someone goes on Reddit and says don't use Frank's convenience store because they stole my credit card, or I got ripped off there or whatever. So those are some of the things that we would say would be why you want to contribute to making sure you're PCI compliant.
Yeah, there's some direct financial cost, reputation, and there's some risk that's all associated with not being it. So you could certainly be held to be negligent if you're not. What are some of the setbacks if a company finds they are not PCI compliant? Kind of following right along with what you're talking about here.
Yeah. So here's the interesting thing, Will, is that there's no real setback. Like the business often doesn't know that they're not PCI compliant. In fact, when we started to approach our customers, my MSP customers, first question is, are you accepting electronic payments, right? So, the 30% who weren't, they went on their merry way. The other 70%, we would drill in a little bit. And one of the telltale signs was obtaining the credit card statements. And what I found was that the majority of my customers didn't get the paper copies. They don't send them to you. They're electronic and they usually exist in some portal. It's almost like the processor doesn't really want you to see the card, maybe, or the statements maybe to go through there. But on there, at the very bottom, I'd say about 50% of them was a non-PCI compliance fee with a dollar amount. And what's amazing is you can continue to process and do everything along the way, and your processor will just charge you a fee, $35, $50, $75 a month for being what they consider non-compliant. And typically that's related to a lack of doing like a self-assessment questionnaire or attesting to other things that you say that you're doing. But you can basically truck along here and just continue to operate business as usual. The downside here, of course, is if you do find out that you're non-compliant and there is a breach of some sort, you could not be covered, right? You could be fully liable because you were never in compliance in terms of what the provider saw.
Yeah, so you think you're with a good reputable company that's got security and all those kinds of things, but because they've denoted and they're going to say, well, every month we told you weren't compliant and you didn't do anything about it, and so now increased risk that could be there for you, not to mention the fee that you're potentially paying for that as well. So there's a lot of people that not even realize that they're not PCI compliant. So that's a good tip there, Frank, that somebody could go hop on that portal and look at their bill and see, hey, are they compliant or not? What are some of the best practices that you would recommend, for somebody that's like, hey, if I understand it's important, I want to meet the PCI compliance. What are some of the best practices that they should put in place?
Yeah, so PCI, what's called DSS, outlines 12 different areas that you need to look at. And if you take a look at maybe about 6 of those. A lot of them are covered by what I would say a traditional MSP would handle for a customer as part of their cybersecurity program. So things like make sure there's a firewall, make sure that we have antivirus on all the computers, make sure we're following, least privilege access. So, only people who need access, have it, and the least privilege that they could get by with. So those are some of the areas, but other ones may not be so easy to handle, right? So it's things like making sure that there's encryption end to end, like from the credit card reader all the way on up. Some are on, pretty much totally in the purview of the end customer. Like, don't write credit cards down and store them. And if you have them electronic, make sure that they're encrypted and not unencrypted. So there's 12 different things that you could look at. What I would recommend is that you start with the ones that an MSP can handle for you first. You'll likely find off that you're checking a bunch of those automatically. Then you look at the ones that are more process related. So, policies and procedures are important. If people don't know they're not supposed to do that, then, there's a good chance they could violate that. And then there's that middle area. And that's usually where maybe the provider will help you out with some technology, things like point of sale systems, or like we talked about, those credit card readers. Make sure you upgrade those to the latest versions that will read the chips. Or now you even see the ones, except Apple Pay and whatnot. So keeping up with the technology is really important to do.
Yeah. So reaching out to the experts that you've got, or if you feel like the experts you've got now can't handle it, maybe you need to talk to somebody new, and make sure you're covered in those 3 ways. So I think that's great. Well, Frank, it was awesome having you come on our podcast today. Again, thank you so much. I know you're a busy guy, and look forward to seeing you here soon out in Vegas in June.
Thanks, Will. Appreciate having me here, and had fun talking with you. So thanks so much. Have a great day.
All right.